also not too shabby. Let's get right into this. Great weekend of fights in London. And let's start with Samuel Baba Jimi Manuwa. You know that's his name? Ooh. Samuel Baba Jimi Manuwa. Turned 37 in February. And say what you want about his ability to compete with the big four, right? John Jones, Daniel Cormier, Anthony Rumble Johnson, Alexander Gustafsson. Those are your big four at 205 pounds. Glover Teixeira maybe makes it a big five. And I'm sure there's a name I'm forgetting. But Jimi Manuwa just dusted Corey Anderson, Kenny, in 3 minutes and 5 seconds. Back-to-back performance of the night bonuses here after the knockout of Ovince St. Preux, which was back in October, I believe, and follows it up here with a massive, massive win in the main event. I don't know if the ceiling is championship, but I'd certainly like to see this kid get a crack, and I shouldn't call him a kid. He is younger than me, though, so I can get away with it. Big, big weekend for Jimi Manuwa.
Dude, Manuwa is an absolute beast, and I remember looking him up right before his UFC debut, and his highlight of knockouts was just something to behold. It looked like guys were just getting sniped from nowhere. I mean, they all freeze, and it was the exact same thing he did to Corey. He hit that left hook, man, and he stiffed before he even hit the canvas. He was literally, his toes were completely stiff as he got hit with that left hook. It was just nasty, amazing power. Manuwa continues to improve. And I think that last win against OSP gave him a lot of momentum and confidence. And apparently the guy has been training like a maniac ever since, to the point where maybe he's overtraining. But either way, it worked. He looked great. Corey Anderson is not an easy matchup for a lot of guys. He can wrestle. He can strike. He moves a lot. Manuwa maybe threw like 4 punches in that fight, and he landed that one, and that was it. He was so efficient and calm and composed. Dude, Manuwa is an animal, and I would love to see a rematch against a Rumble Johnson at some point. Those guys, both of them, have tremendous amount of power. Obviously, it didn't go well for Manuwa the first time around, but I think this is a different Manuwa mentally. Has a lot more confidence, and he's one of those guys with just a special amount of power.
And he is the poster boy. I remember it well. September 29, 2012, we called his UFC debut in Nottingham, England against Kyle Kingsbury. I think the swelling has finally come down for Kyle Kingsbury like 5 years later, right? So Jimi Manuwa, he enters the UFC 11-0 with 10 knockouts, bunch of title defenses, all finishes. And he was all the rage coming into the UFC and knocked out his first 3 UFC opponents, Cyril Diabate, Ryan Jimmo, the late Ryan Jimmo, the other 2. Those were TKOs due to leg injuries, right? But then ran into Alexander Gustafsson and eventually Anthony Rumble Johnson. But everybody that this guy has been favored to beat, he has just crippled. And he was talking some shit a little bit about John Jones after the fact. Yeah. Wants to fight the winner of Daniel Cormier and Anthony Rumble Johnson. And Kenny, I feel like the calendar aligns pretty well here for Jimi Manuwa, given the fact that UFC 210 is less than 3 weeks away, and there aren't a lot of obvious names there in that top 5. Glover Teixeira and Alexander Gustafsson, I believe, are going to fight. John Jones is on the sidelines. Jimi Manuwa could get the next crack at the title, and if Daniel Cormier is the guy, I think a Cormier-Manuwa fight would have a lot of legs for people.
Yeah, I think the big hurdle for him is probably the scheduling of what they're going to do and when they do that fight. Because I think John Jones is back in July.
Right.
And so obviously Jones would probably get that next shot. But again, I mean, like, how many times are you going to try to put that John Jones-Daniel Cormier fight together? It seems like something always happens. And obviously Rumble could win, which could change things a little bit. But, it's been crazy, that 205 division. So Manuwa could get that next shot. I think he's done enough at this point. He's exciting. He's going to go for the knockout. It's going to be exciting when he shows up. And he definitely has a huge fan base in the UK, man. They really got up for him.
And when you have that type of one-strike fight-ending power, I think it's a great source of confidence. And this is one of the better knockout artists in the history of mixed martial arts when you look at the resume. He really is. I mean, Go Google poster boy Jimi Manuwa. I mean, unbelievable some of the early highlights, granted against non-UFC competition, but dude's an absolute beast. And, I feel like Corey Overtime Anderson is kind of a beast and has to swallow this loss. He's now lost 2 of his last 3, lost to Shogun Rua by split decision, somewhat controversially at UFC 198. Hard work can only get you so far, and that's not to say that Corey Anderson isn't a supremely skilled athlete. I think he's very realistic about where he's at relative to the top of this division, but this is a significant setback for Corey. Would you agree?
It is. Lucky for him that at 205 they do need more contenders. They do need more fighters that can kind of fight for the belt. So I think that with a couple wins, it puts him right back into the conversation. He's still growing as a mixed martial artist. I think he's going to learn a lot training under Mark Henry and Ricardo Almeida. And so, yes, listen, I think he showed a lot of great sportsmanship. I think he was realistic, with his expectations in this fight. He was all class after congratulating Jimi Manuwa. I think he'll be back stronger for sure.
Co-main event, Gunnar Nelson defeats Alan Jouban, guillotine choke there in round number 2. And Jouban, and this is not anything groundbreaking, but doesn't necessarily get the credit for his striking because of his grappling, right? But he said that going into this fight, he just, or in the octagon, I should say, he just felt different. I think there's a different confidence now for Gunnar Nelson at this stage of his UFC career with a wealth of UFC experience now. You know, you have to believe that if he were to fight a guy like Rick Story again, he probably wins that fight, which he lost a 5-rounder by split decision back in 2014, has won 3 of 4 since, only blemish against Damian Maia, obviously, which is no easy task. So submission wins over Brandon Thatch, Albert Tumenov, and now Alan Jouban. Gunnar Nelson is a real problem, Kenny, and I do think a top 10 guy right now at 170 pounds and competitive really with anybody in that top 10, at least in my opinion.
I agree, man. I think he learned a lot from that loss against Damian Maia. I think he stepped it up in all accounts, all aspects of his game. And he had that kind of swagger about him. He had that confidence heading to that octagon, similar to what Conor had in his fight against Eddie Alvarez. You could see it on his face that he was not going to lose that fight. And, Gunnar is pretty stoic in his approach, but there was just something about him that night that made me comfortable with picking him. And Jouban is a tough out. You know what I mean? Yeah. Jouban's a tough out for anybody. He's very well-rounded. He's solid everywhere. He's a guy that doesn't make a heck of a lot of mistakes. But Gunny just seemed very loose. And, I mean, in all aspects, his punches are like whips. He just seemed very composed. And those shots were just brutal, man, that he landed on Jouban. And if you put your head forward and you're in that front headlock position, Gunnar Nelson's going to take you out, man. His guillotine is legendary. I've seen him, man, out-wrestle and out-grapple some of the best fighters in the world. I've seen it with my own eyes. I knew this kid was going to be something. And now we see it with his striking. His striking is catching up with his high-level grappling skills. And I agree, man. He's someone to watch, and he's a guy that, deserves to be in the top 5 right now.
And we love him here because he doesn't cut any weight, right? Smarter than the rest of you guys.
He probably – dude, he probably walks at like 180 pounds. I mean, you just don't see that. Most of the guys who fight at welterweight are around 190 pounds, maybe plus in the offseason. Gunnar, he just fights basically what he walks around at. He's doing it right. Doesn't use performance-enhancing drugs, never been caught using it, doesn't have that look. And just a phenomenal fighter, man, a real martial artist.
A lot smarter than you guys, not staring death in the face, too.
That's right. That's right.
And, dude, I hate to harken back to that Rick Story split decision loss, but it was just sort of a weird main event there in Stockholm, Sweden a couple of years ago. And if you take that away, and I know you can't do that, but for the sake of argument, you take that away, he's 16-1-1 with the only loss by decision to Damian Maia, who is about as suffocating a guy as there is to compete against in the world. So maybe we shouldn't be surprised at just how easy Gunnar Nelson seemingly made it look over the weekend. Now his coach, John Kavanagh, is calling for a fight against Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. I think he tweeted something, let's see who the real Karate Kid is, or whatever the tweet was. I mean, that fight has real legs for me. I think the fact that Gunnar Nelson is on a winning streak and Stephen Wonderboy Thompson is coming off a loss, at times that has given the promotion pause to make that fight. But Joe Silva's not walking through that door. Maybe that was part of his philosophy. I don't know. But I think this is a fight that could certainly headline an FS1 show, and I wouldn't be surprised at all to see them make it.
There's no doubt about that, man. And what kind of confidence does he have when you're calling out Wonderboy?
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, coming off of a loss and a guy who no one really wants to fight, Wonderboy is so dangerous. But I think Gunnar is extremely confident right now with his jiu-jitsu, with his striking. He's keeping the proper range. He's very relaxed. And, yeah, I agree, man. That should be a main event of a FS1 fight night. I would love to see it. I think that's a smart approach because you beat a guy like Wonderboy, and if you do it convincingly, you get a title shot.
Chito Vera is going to join us here in about 5 minutes or so I don't want to spend too much time on his fight against Brad Pickett here because we're going to talk about it there. But at least for Brad Pickett, right? It looked like he was working his way towards a win, and to go out, on top with a win in his retirement fight, like guys like Chris Lytle and Mark Munoz have been able to do. And Chito Vera certainly had other ideas. So unfortunately for Pickett, this career ends with losses in 6 of his last 7, sandwiched around a split decision win over Francisco Rivera. But there's no denying how much he has meant to this region and to this sport, and how many big spots he found himself in repeatedly. Let's not forget, this is the last guy to beat Demetrius Johnson back at WEC 48 by unanimous decision. Granted, that was not at 125 pounds for DJ, but he's been a bonus machine throughout his WEC and UFC tenure, and just really leaves an indelible mark on the sport. I am not the only one who's going to miss Brad One Punch Pickett.
Yeah, my heart breaks for him. Obviously fighting in his home country. I know he wanted to go out with the win. Chito, obviously a very tough out. And even in that first round where I thought Brad Pickett won, you could see that Chito was figuring out Brad Pickett. He was landing some shots that were really getting me to be very concerned for Brad as that fight moved on. I think the only thing that was going for Brad was maybe Chito was going to gas late in that fight. That really never happened. And Chito just kept chipping away, looking for those big shots. And Brad defensively, was putting himself in harm's way. And ultimately it was Chito getting the win in phenomenal fashion. But what a fight. And at the end of the day, man, that does sum up who Brad Pickett was as a fighter. He's a guy who was always moving forward. He always had that shot of looking for the knockout, had that kind of power, very well-rounded, as tough as they come. And even after the fight, he's like, I really wish they would have let me at least get knocked out cold. I mean, that's who Brad Pickett is, man.
Right.
So,
right.
Brad, thank you for all the amazing